Hello and welcome everybody to the January 9th edition of the Gateway API Community Sync. Just a reminder that this is a meeting governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which boils down to be nice and respectful to one another on this call. We don't have a super heavy agenda for today, but we do have Grant Spence starting us out with a discussion about session persistence behavior. Let me get my screen shared here. And then if anybody else has anything to add, please do feel free. There's a pretty short agenda for today, so feel free to add something directly to the Google Doc. All right. I just started reading this because I just got back from holiday break and I had several 100,000 notifications. So I'm not 100% caught up on it, but I think I'm getting the gist of what we're doing here. Grant, do you want to go ahead and start talking about it?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, so in one of the meetings in November, I think we talked about a couple of things. One of them was session persistence. And the idea that was thrown out is that if we switch implementations from one implementation to the other, we want to establish some sort of expectation that it will behave in the same way, or at least I guess that's what we're proposing here. So I think Nick recommended either go ahead and just make an issue so we can have a place to talk about it, possibly make a conformance test. But I think we can talk about that here in a minute, but that might be a bit of a contentious thing. But the goal here and what we wrote up, I worked with Candace and Micaiah a little bit on this, is that we want, we would like implementations to specify how they implement session persistence to sort of establish that expectation. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that your point about starting off with defining what session persistence is a very good call. That has been making sure we're all speaking the same language has historically been one of the biggest hurdles for us to overcome in talking about this sort of thing. Yeah, I think yeah, so I think it's a very fair point that you have in there about how session persistence is often used for, but is not necessarily the same thing as session affinity. Yeah, or they're often used in tandem, but they're not the same thing. That's a very good point. Yeah, I really like the issue. I have had a bit of a look over it. I think in general, it's a really awesome issue. Basically, you have essentially written a very small cap inside that first post of the issue, a very small gap. So nice work. Yeah. Rob, do you have anything you want to say?
No, I love this. I want to clarify though, I kind of got two perspectives on this. One was that it seemed like there was interest in just documenting what implementations of Gateway API are already doing, which great start, thank you. But then the other thing is, it seems like there's at least some interest as this being the starting point for an actual GEP to provide a way to configure this in the API itself. Am I understanding that second part correctly?
Yeah, that's not the intention of this initially, but I did mention that I think this is a great starting point for that, to move towards. I think what you meant is having that in sort of like the official spec, so you can set up or configure session persistence. Is that what you meant?
Not exactly.
Okay.
Like we have like Kubernetes enhancement proposals are like living proposals that get updated iteratively that aren't necessarily set in stone, or like we're not like all in on them until we say yes, we're ready to take this and start actually implementing this. So it's like a growing document or a declaration of intent for like a proposal. Your thing is doing exactly that. They're under if you look in the repo, they're all under site, so like here, I'll show you where they're. They're all under site source and then just GEPs, and you'll kind of see all the different proposals. It doesn't have to be a completed thing to be in here either, and we also have some that are declined and so forth. So there's probably the overview, I think, will give you kind of an idea of what is going on in here. But suffice to say, you're already kind of like close to the format, and we would want a GEP for this eventually anyway. So I mean, I'd like to just kind of see it. I think it's almost ready to just make the GEP out of it, which is more or less just putting it in a different place at this point.
Yeah. So I think what Shane's saying is, yeah, I think it's really useful. What you're saying here is 100% correct. We do need to document what session persistence is and what everybody does for session persistence. But it does seem like the natural extension of this is to sort of be like, and how do we configure session persistence in the Gateway API? Yeah, like which we currently don't have a way to do. Yeah, because right now all the implementations might support it, but there's no language or space in the API for you to actually ask for it to be configured. Does that make sense?
If you're speaking, I can't hear you, Grant.
Oh yeah, I haven't. No, I wasn't speaking, but yeah, that
Okay.
makes sense to me. Like, yeah, it at least defining it in the beginning.
Yeah.
A GEP can help do that. I think one of the goals, I guess, was to have implementations actually document somewhere in their documentation how they support it. I don't really know if the precedent on that. I mean, if you guys sort of require implementations to document somewhere, or Candace mentioned below, or about like having some sort of central repository of features that we could like have implementations put in if they support session persistence and how they do that.
So
Yeah.
this is Bowie. I have a question. So let's say we can agree on a standard for cookie-based session persistence. That sounds to me like that falls completely within what we're talking about in terms of extended features. Basically a standardized feature that might actually not necessarily be implemented by all things. Is that what, I guess I'm trying to understand what the documentation of the features versus the existing model of having extended features. Does my question make sense? Like, is that aligned with what you're thinking, or are you proposing something in addition to that?
Yeah, I think the difference here is that we don't have a way to configure this in Gateway API as it stands today. So even before we have some sort of API for that, the question is whether we should have implementations specify what their default session persistence functionality is. Does that make sense?
I take this as what Grant, correct me if I'm wrong, Grant. You're advocating for basically just having more people from different implementations come in and just declare how they could or could not implement this and what that would look like before, as like a baseline. Is that what you're kind of advocating for?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. I think the hope was also to get what their default functionality is today. So we have, maybe it's jumping the gun, but it'd also be nice if they could tell us, like, as of today, if we switch between implementations, what our expectation would be for session persistence, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, I think, yeah, I understand what you're saying. Like, you want to sort of get an idea of the lay of the land before we start looking to go too far into sort of writing down how you configure it. I think I think in the past we haven't gone too far down that road because, like, to some extent, like, as long as everyone supports the same thing, part of the way that you draw out, like, the best way to draw out, I think, what works, like what everyone can do is to sort of start. One of the easiest ways is actually to start designing, like, how you describe the thing. And that's one of the best ways that you can sort of, I think the table you've got there is pretty much already, if we could fill out that table a bit more, then that's pretty much everything we need. You know, if in terms of that effort. I think that there's another question there that you've asked that I see you, Bowie. I'll get you in a sec. That I think is another thing. So we do not currently have a way to sort of say, you know, you have to document this, right? Like we don't have a way for it to sort of, we haven't done that in the past where we have said implementations, you know, must. I think we've got it in a couple of places where it's like, you may do this and you got to, and if so, you need to tell people or something like that. But I think we might have only done that once before for an extended feature. So I think this is a similar thing in that, you know, it's like the session persistence may be implemented, but like right now, because there's no way to configure it, like it's like, you know, it's kind of like there's nothing for us to tell people to do, like because there's no language in the API to do it. So I think what you seem to be saying is like you'd like to have that paragraph. If you just go down a bit, Shane, there's a italicized paragraph there that is what you're proposing that we include. Is that right, Grant?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we can include that, but like right now, it's not really going to have much value because because we haven't got a way to do it. So like there's no way that you can do session persistence at the moment because we haven't talked about how we would do it. Sorry, Bowie, I talked too much. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. No problems. Yeah, I think the one thing is I don't know if most implementations would have any sort of persistence like by default. So it's kind of hard to say that. It sounds mostly like you're trying to come up with a shape of something that could be standardized is what I'm hearing. This is a question. Because I don't know if anything out of the box would just persist sessions. That sounds like a fairly big semantic assumption.
If you take a look at the chart that Grant put together, to me that indicates that many implementations have thought about it and documented it, and there's fewer that don't offer anything in terms of the level that he's looking for.
I think Bowie might be getting at whether or not it's on by default, which seemed to be something Grant was trying to identify in implementations, if I'm not mistaken.
I think we need to let Bowie answer that one and then over to
Vinod. Yeah, that's what I meant is that I don't think it's on by default. This one is a very good table of what's possible with the different implementations.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me too. Vinod, what did you want to say?
Yeah, I was thinking we're talking about how this is implemented across various implementations, but should we also look at what are the needs from session persistence? I mean, things have moved a long way since we've started doing this in HTTP. There's certain applications that don't like cookies for a particular reason. Some that don't want things to be in the URL, or if we can get that information from these vendors to qualify why they pick this the implementation method they have, that might be more useful information to use as for something to standardize on.
I would suggest looking at the opposite population, which is what do the users want, and then that potentially lets us abstract what it ends up being mapped to on the implementation side. Or we could say these are like very standard industry established ways to do session persistence, like cookies and so forth, and we give a standardized way to configure it.
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the side of the we talk to the users because it's going to be the users writing the YAML at the end of the day. Yeah, so John.
Just from a user's point of view, like we use session persistence from a firewall point of view for failover. So if a instance fails in a cluster, you want to failover to the other instances. You want a session for that session to be propagated across the cluster.
Yeah, I think in this case, this one is mainly talking about HTTP session persistence. Am I right?
Yeah, I noticed that. I was going to say it's depending on the route class. So it's then it gets even more complicated because then you've got session persistence for HTTP route, and do you have session persistence for any other routes?
Yeah, it feels to me like session persistence for HTTP requires configuration by the end user. You need to be able to say the session persistence should work using this metadata of the connection, cookie, header, that sort of thing. For TCP and UDP though, session persistence is kind of, you're only ever really using the 5 tuple, and so like that feels like more of an implementation detail that could be defaulted to on or off on a per implementation basis. So I think it is very useful. It's very useful to keep that in mind, that session persistence for on a per route basis will be different. But I think we probably should clarify that in this case, we are talking about HTTP route session persistence, and that session persistence for other routes will be dependent on the type of route. So gRPC route will be able to use HTTP route semantics broadly, I would guess. And then TCP route, UDP route, and TLS route probably will only be able to use properties of the other properties of the connection. So session persistence for those will be different. So yeah, I think that's a very good call out. Thank you, John, to remind us that this API is not just HTTP, although a lot of the use cases are, and so we need to be careful to be specific in our language.
Also, are there any implications to security with what we're doing here? What do we need to consider?
Yeah, I think that in general, I don't think there are, because as long as we do it in the ways that people have worked out already, like people have worked out sort of reasonable approximations for security here. Like as long as most of the time when you're configuring the cookie-based session persistence, you're saying session persistence should be done using the value of this cookie. And then it's, and sometimes for Envoy-based ones, sometimes it's like Envoy will store the session persistence in this specific Envoy cookie. And so, so you can ensure that you're not using like the auth cookie for session persistence as well or something. And so similarly for header stuff. So I think this is one advantage of the fact that I think the broadest way that I would describe what Grant is suggesting here is that we basically take the stuff that people are doing already and make it so that you can configure that. We take the stuff that people are doing already, make it so that you can configure that somehow in the API is the sort of next step. But the first step that Grant is talking about in this issue is, let's talk about what you can configure already, and let's be clear on what implementations can do, so that then when it comes time to just define the language that we use to be able to configure implementations, that we keep in mind what they can do already, and what people are expecting to do is probably the other thing that's important. That's what Bowie was talking about. We're talking about what users want to see. It's important to keep in mind what a user would expect to be configuring when they're configuring session persistence. Candice.
Good points. I agree with everything that you've said. I just wanted to add something, and I already mentioned this in Grant's pull request. I think that the chart that he's using, and Shane, I think you brought up the chart before. There's a chart like this, a spreadsheet of all features, but this is for Ingress controllers. And funny enough, there's a Gateway API line on the left. It's a little bit out of date. But if we had something like this for implementations, it would be really, really useful, I think.
Yeah, I remember this chart. This chart's from, they've updated it fairly recently. But yeah, this is from forever ago.
I 100% agree that having a table like this somewhere would be really useful. I think that a manually updated table like this one is suboptimal in that it requires a lot of manual update. I think that the best way that I can think of to do this is to have it be that that there's some way that you or me as being implementation owners can PR something into the Gateway API repo that will then generate a table like that. That would be my sort of, and ideally, eventually that one would hope that would be tied into the conformance testing. And so, you know, I think the ideal dream state for this is that you run the conformance tests enabling certain extended features that produces a conformance test output of some sort. You upload the conformance test output of some sort to a specific place in the repo, and then that generates those specific results all end up generating a feature comparison like this. So basically you get a conformance test level feature comparison of what works. That's the dream. We're a long way from that, but like in my mind, that is the dream. Sorry. So Candace, I'll leave you got your hand up to respond. Sorry.
Oh no, that was you're responding to what I had my hand up for, and I think that's a great idea. Beautiful idea.
And I'll just follow up then. That is absolutely something we've been thinking about for a long time, and I hope we're not that far away. You know, one of the things that we've been talking about is if controllers can publish that to gateway class status specifically, and then our conformance tests read from that. Right now we have in conformance test this concept of supported features, basically feature gates. I'd love to get rid of those entirely and replace them with things that were published on gateway class itself. I'm hoping that's not that huge of a transition to make. When we discussed broader themes with other SIG Network reviewers for 060 release, this is something that came up in that discussion. There was some hesitancy of doing something that was just for Gateway API, because apparently this is a problem that there's broad interest in solving Kubernetes wide instead of just for Gateway API. So if anything, we may get a little slowed down by trying to solve this more broadly. But if we can solve it just for Gateway API, I think it is fairly straightforward, hopefully straightforward. I'd love to make that a priority.
I feel like we should aim to solve it for Gateway API and then use that as a base for people to spring off of for the broader upstream. It's easier to talk about an implementation for broader upstream when you have a worked example for a more specific thing, I think. Sorry, Bowie.
Yeah, I just want to caution that we should probably restrict the actual stuff to things in extended, because one of the reasons that spreadsheet exists is that the Ingress API basically didn't describe, it described like almost nothing, and all the functionality was sort of on the side. I think if that becomes the case for Gateway API, we kind of have failed in some ways. So that's my comment, is that once it gets out of the standardized API, it becomes kind of tricky, right? Like, what are the rows in that case? Because they could become massive.
I agree that a summary sheet like that one should really only reflect the things that could possibly be different rather than the things that must be the same. So it is, however, useful to note that implementations do not have to sort of support all of the different route types. So it would certainly be useful to mark down, does the implementation support, HTTP route? Does the implementation support gRPC route, TLS route, TCP route, UDP route? And then have extended features based on the route types. That feels like the right way to structure that information to me. But yeah, I 100% agree, Bowie, that there's no point having, supports weighted load balancing when that's core. Like, in order to support the resource, you have to support that. So yeah, there's no value in listing all of those things separately. Maybe, I mean, it could be that it's useful for people who don't understand anything about the API to have all the core features listed. I don't know.
So
but I 100% agree. Also, sorry, last thing, effectively in Ingress, almost every single feature was implementation specific because there was no conformance. So the idea here is for Gateway API is that we have extended for a reason. You know, we have core and extended for a reason. So now we can make it, hey, yeah, we can list the extended things. Yeah, and implementation specific things, I mean, we have specifically ruled them out from the API because we want people to bring them to extended. Yeah, you can do implementation specific stuff, but ideally that's either something that's so specific that it's never going to be implementable by other people, or it is an experiment to figure out the right way to build something extended.
Bowie
This is the
says in
sort
the
of-
chat, I meant
Yeah.
the other way. Implementation
Yeah.
specific things are going to be tricky to talk about.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about there. Yeah.
Roger that.
Yeah. Sorry, Vinod, I cut you off.
Might have been me. Did Vinod, did you have something to say?
Not me.
Okay.
Okay.
I think it was me. I was gonna say, since we're at 30 minutes, not that we have a huge agenda, maybe we should start thinking about the action items that we want to take here. To me, it seems that we have two potential actions that we've kind of discussed so far. One of them is working this issue into a gap. That way it can be kind of put in the repo potentially as provisional, and then have other people who are interested iterate on it until we get it to a point where we can agree that it's something that we can put into experimental. And then the other thing would seem to be that we need to at least make an issue for Candace's spreadsheet with some of the caveats that we just discussed. Those seem like the two action items.
Yeah, I think the last thing was, do we want to put that the italicized paragraph that Grant has included in there? Do we want to action putting that somewhere in the spec? You know, it's probably okay to do that right away, to sort of say, you know, session persistence is intended to be included in the API, but we're working on it. See this gap or something like that. Seems like, I don't know.
I'm a bit hesitant to do that for every gap in progress, because you know, it could become unmaintainable. If I'm understanding the request correctly, to add it to the spec directly, I think I would rather, you know, just encourage people to watch our gaps for things coming up, as opposed to putting anything that could potentially come in our spec itself. We've seen with gaps that most of them make it through, but sometimes despite our best efforts, gaps end up not working because, you know, they're not as broadly implementable as we thought they could be, or, you know, whatever. And I don't want to overpromise anything in the spec itself.
Yeah, I hesitate to add that one myself. I think that starting to say, hey, you need to have this documented to be compliant might have some merit in time, but trying to do that right now with one specific thing feels like it's just going to end up, it could end up just kind of going under the rug a little bit. I don't know. In the past, and this is mostly for, I guess, for Grant's benefit. In the past, we've had more of a, they need to come here and talk to us kind of approach, which has been successful. So I think you want to kind of like push things out, but we usually pull people in and get the people who are the most, you know, the people who care after several months of us saying, hey, we have a thing we're trying to do, and we talk to people and we kind of get the word out. It usually works out. I can't think of any really bad fallout we've ever had from an API where like somebody later comes along, now knock on wood, you know, and says, hey, you missed me, and now I absolutely can't implement that. What do you think, Grant? Are you okay with us kind of, what are your feelings or thoughts on not pushing for like the push out to everybody, please document your stuff, but rather just doing this with a gap and having people starting to pull in people from the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. We could probably continue some of this conversation in the gap itself, I guess, as well. But yeah, I think I yield to your judgment about the precedent of, you know, requiring documentation from implementations.
So
Okay.
yeah, in terms of the next steps, I would say, Grant, would you please be able to just literally take the markdown that you have there and drop it into you have a look at there is a template in GEP 696. I think you pretty much match the template already. Would you mind being the one to sort of pull that into a PR and get this GEP in as sort of a provisional / introduction? I can't remember what this, is it just provisional or the the status?
Provisional is the right one.
Yeah, for sure. You can put my name down.
Yeah, awesome, great. And then I mean, you could probably just change the title of that issue to be GEP, session persistence behavior or something like that, and then make it and then sort of note down that we've created this, and so this will become GEP 1619.
Got it.
Yep, awesome.
And then the issue, or if you're feeling really froggy, the PR for or what have you for adding the spreadsheet. Does anybody want to go ahead and like create that issue? I would also recommend somebody who's feeling really strongly about needing that potentially taking that one.
Just to clarify, are we trying to maintain a feature spreadsheet, or?
It sounded like to me.
So I don't know. I think that we should not try to maintain a feature spreadsheet. I think that we should we should absolutely have an issue that sort of documents what we talked about with the eventual vision of the conformance tests rolling into a summary table of features that implementation support. That's the sort of the dream, and then we can have steps along the way towards that dream. But the it'd be good that then becomes a good epic for sort of tracking a lot of the efforts around conformance, because in order for us to have that summary table, there's a bunch of stuff we need to have working, like we need to have conformance tested output things in a standard way, and status in the gateway class, and ways for people to submit a report that then gets integrated in some way into the table.
Is there a better way I could capture that in an action item?
Yeah, let's do that one, and then leave the action item with me, because I think I have a pretty clear idea of what we need to do.
Okay.
I'll start the issue off, but then I'd love to hear that one will be one that I will be asking for people to contribute to.
Awesome. All right. We had a pretty good long conversation about this. It seems pretty neat. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. Thank you for bringing it up, Grant, and thank you for all the effort you put into that very nice document. I do think it's probably just going to pretty much like Lego into a GEP, which would be cool. We got a couple of action items, so we should be able to move forward from here. Does anybody have anything else to say on this topic, or can we move on? All right, let's move on to triage. Race conditions and route status updates. I'm behind on everything right now.
Yeah, this is a fun one. Ivan asked this in Slack a bit ago, and I responded there, but it is one that is something I don't think many of us have thought much about, and we missed some things that would have made this easier to deal with. But basically, if you take a route and you immediately attach it to two gateways, you run into a potential race condition where both controllers are trying to update status at the same time, which is not going to be pretty. I spent a while chatting with Antoine about this. You can see I copied him on this issue because he is great at API machinery things and helps me understand things that I don't understand. Apparently, a couple takeaways from this. First off, and this may be something that others already understand, but first off, if this were to happen and both controllers were calling update status, which is what I would expect to happen, the first controller is going to win. And because both updates are going to have a resource version in them, the next controller is going to fail and have to retry and fetch again and try and update again. So hopefully controllers have that retry logic already. If, on the other hand, we had done this properly from the outset and added a list type with a map key, we could have avoided any kind of conflicts here, and consecutive updates could work without a retry. to do that, we would actually, unfortunately, need to retroactively add another field here, because in our status, we have a parent ref and a controller name, and you can't index based on a struct inside a struct. That's not going to work. And controller name is not unique. So we need something in there to be unique if we want to handle this, make this easier to handle. I can try and summarize this on the issue itself, but I think the summary is that we just need a bit more time spent on this to make it easier, less painful for controllers to deal with. This is the kind of thing that I imagine every controller is not going to catch in their own E2E test, because they're just testing with their own implementation. But it is a pretty annoying edge case that I could imagine could get controllers stuck indefinitely if they're not handling this appropriately.
This
So-
isn't, yeah, this isn't like a surprise to me. And actually, Dave said in the chat, it's kind of a general case issue, which is true. At the same time, it's also true that you can make it better.
Yeah.
Are there, I feel like this is the right question to ask, so bear with me. Are there implementations out there that are doing an update and then ignoring conflict?
I have we have enough implementations. I'm assuming there's at least some that don't know.
Because my first inclination, when I didn't read this earlier, because this is only a couple hours old, but my first inclination when I started thinking about this was like, most updates are checked for errors, and if it's a conflict, you go back and just do the reconciliation over again, right? So naturally, I would expect this to be accounted for, maybe.
You would think so, yes. You can also imagine a case, we are doing things right now where we are now requiring observed generation to be bumped. So for controllers that weren't incrementing that before, if they move to that now, it's just going to increase the chance that these conflicts happen. I agree that everyone should be checking for that. My own personal take is there's probably some that aren't. I don't know of any, but I'm assuming they exist. My other concern here is that we do have a way to make this mostly go away just by adding an API field to status. And I think that is probably.
Well,
Rob,
okay.
doesn't that only apply to patch?
What?
The merge, right? If you did an update, you would still clobber.
Oh, that's fair. You're right.
So you will still clobber, but the other thing that you can keep in mind is if you're using the reconcile pattern that controller runtime does, then so the fact that you lost the race will mean that your update, the trick is that you need to be careful about when you're applying status updates, that you actually like check the status you have and make sure that you're any status you don't know about, you reapply. And then if you do that, then the status it'll work itself out. But that's the tricky part, is that the thing that will happen here is that one of them will clobber the other, but then the one that got clobbered will get an event saying, hey, the status got updated, the object was updated. And so when you get an update event for an object you care about, you need to check that your status is present. And if it's not, then take whatever status it has and update your status. If you do that, then there'll be a period where the status sort of flip-flops a little bit, but then it'll work out okay on a human timescale. It's unfortunate, but like that's what happens with this race condition. Like as long as you're checking correctly, then everything will be okay. As long as you're checking correctly is the operative word there. It can be tricky to make sure that you're doing this correctly. Possibly we could put in some implementation guidance for people to say it's really important that when you write your status, that you take whatever status is there and add your bit over the top. You don't just blind copy in the parent refs, like the status, that list. You need to take the list and sort of merge your changes into it properly. That's probably the main thing. If you do that, then this problem will become a non-problem, because resolve itself.
This also
So-
becomes something easier to like write a test for once we have something like Blixt where we can like plug in an implementation twice and like actually create these kinds of contention situations.
Yes.
But my inclination is that you would have to be kind of doing some things wrong to break on this. Not that doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, because if it's too easy to do something wrong, then that's something we should improve.
Yeah, you are right. I mean, this is a common enough Kubernetes issue. It's just, I feel like there are some unique bits of our API. One, we are implemented by a lot of different controllers. In some cases, I would imagine it's the first time people are writing Kubernetes controllers. And then second, this API really encourages multiple controllers to write status to the same resource, which is not something that's seen in many other Kubernetes APIs.
It's a little rare.
Yeah. So I feel like at minimum, we need to document this well. I am really curious if there's a way we can write some conformance tests to cover this, like if conformance tests actually wrote something to status themselves. And
I think
I don't know.
so. We could.
Yeah.
I think that Shane has a good point that if you have an implementation like Blixt that's like a relatively neutral reference implementation that you could use to be the other implementation in this case, then then you can do a status thing where there are two separate implementations and they coordinate correctly, and that you end up with the correct result. That, in my mind, is a conformance test for this. Like that after a certain amount of time, the status is correct. But yeah, like that Mackay asked that question. Can you have a conformance test to verify it? Like, I think you can, but it'll require either that your implementation supports running two instances, which is not ideal, or we have some standard implementation that knows how to do enough that it can interact with the status. If you interact with the status on the gateways, for example, then that is probably all we need to test that this is working, because most people are going to reuse similar code for the things. And I mean, I think that's the key part here, is that we need some implementation guidance to be like, you need to handle the following cases in your code. We're working on some conformance tests to help you with that, but like, this is the implementation guidance. That said, we don't have our things to consider for implementers page or anything like that at the moment, which possibly we should consider adding.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we do have implementation guidelines. We just probably need to add this somewhere in here to watch out for.
Check for conflicts.
Yeah.
Be
And
careful
check for conflicts and make sure that you're doing status correctly. You're not clobbering status. That's probably the bigger one here, actually, because I know that like in our implementations, we've had to catch ourselves and make sure that we were like, you have to be very deliberate to make sure that you're doing that correctly.
Yeah,
It's very
you have
easy
to ensure
fall
that
out of
you are always merging status, not just blind copying status.
So I can only imagine other implementations might have run afoul of it. So, all right. So that sounds like we got a couple of things. What were those? So one of them was updating the developer guide to add check for conflicts and merge don't clobber statuses. Okay.
Anyone want to volunteer to take that one on?
I'll be the default if nobody else wants to. These are
I
kind
haven't
of smaller
volunteered for
things that
anything
get.
yet. So
Well, this
I
gives
can,
other people like in the room too. Like if you want to grab something that's like truly tiny, like, and you'll get help from Nick, Rob, and myself if you need it. Like it's just like updating some docs. I think this would be a good one. So just to throw that out there. Okay.
yeah, feel free to assign it to me for now, but anyone on the call, if you're interested, just don't hesitate to ping any one of us, and I'm not tied to doing this one.
Rob wants it. All right. Attached Rob. Oh, did we have anything more to say on that?
No, I think we should keep going.
Okay, yeah, we were running pretty low on time. All right, attached routes spec does not clarify how to handle partially invalid states. I have not read this one, I think.
Yeah, okay, so I can give a quick intro on this one. We have attached routes in gateway status for every listener. And we say that it needs to represent the number of routes that have been successfully attached to the listener, but nowhere do we define what successfully attached means. And what is especially unclear is what if the route is partially valid? What if the listener is partially valid? What if there's a lot of edge cases that just are not defined? And somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody started writing conformance tests for attached routes. Thank you. And they had a value that I didn't expect to be the value. And that got me thinking, well, we just didn't define what this is. I think there's at least two options for how we could interpret this. One of them is that we say, hey, attached routes can only represent routes that have actually been programmed by the gateway. This is a very literal meaning of just, if you've programmed this route, it's attached. If you haven't, it's not. The other one is just, I don't care about the status. I don't care if it's been, I don't care about anything. I just know that at some, this route has attempted to attach to me, and there's nothing in the listener configuration that would prevent it from being attached. The second one is the much simpler one to implement. It's just a check. It doesn't depend on the validity of the listener or the route. It is really just some math at that point. The first one seems like it might be slightly, ever so slightly closer to what a user might expect, maybe, but two is so much simpler, and I don't think it, I think it's also a reasonable interpretation that I'm leaning towards the second approach here, but I'm open to other perspectives on this or other options.
Yeah, the first one is, well, what this is saying is, one means that when your route is attached, it's actually attached to your gateway in the underlying sense. The second one means your controller knows about it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I actually like your controller knows about it is the definition of attached.
So I think
I don't know.
this is actually a holdover from the old condition design. So in the old condition design, attached was the condition name. And so really this thing should be called accepted routes, not attached routes, because that is the condition name that it's talking about. So I think if you think about it like the idea here was originally to give you some idea of like how many routes have been have linked up correctly without us needing to maintain like a list of the routes that have been linked up, because that is a fan out, that is a status fan out design disaster waiting to happen. So I think the idea here is, in my mind, is closer to the second one, where it's about the whether or not the route is attached is about whether or not the configuration of the attachment of the link between the listener and the route is successful, not about whether or not the route is available for routing. Right? This is a configuration level thing that tells you whether is the is the route able to sort of attach to the listener, to be accepted in the listener is a better way to say this. Again, the terminology is confusing because it's using the old name for that relationship. We can't really call it accepted, not attached.
I think that's a reasonable interpretation, and yeah, that history makes sense. I was thinking that must be the case as well. I am curious, do we provide any guidance on the accepted condition if a route should be accepted if the listener itself is not valid? So where this came up is there was a conformance test where the TLS certificate ref on the listener was not valid, but the attached route's value was 1. But the route had every reason to be attached. The listener itself was not valid, and I wasn't sure how to interpret that. And I don't know if we have guidance for accepted either in what that means.
Yeah, I can't remember if we have guidance for accepted or not. That would be something to check. But I think in my mind, what we should aim for, regardless, is that the attached routes means accepted routes means they are that the route binding will succeed, configuration wise, not that the route is ready or available. Which I think, so that means that in my mind, that means that the status of the listener should be relatively orthogonal. It's about, it's not, is the listener completely configured? It's, is the attachment between the route and the listener all good to go? And so that, I mean, the thing I think where this is going to be most useful is if you have an allowed routes on a gateway that is like allow routes from anywhere or something like that. And so as the gateway owner, you might want to be like, well, how many routes are actually using this? Are actually using this listener? If there's 20 routes using this listener, maybe don't change the config of the listener in a way that could break it. Whereas if there's 0 routes using this listener, then 0 and by using that means able to attach, not like configured and working. So I think if we go back to like why you have this, it's for the person who owns the gateway to be able to be like, how many of these things like are actually like, how many relationships are there, or how many relationships can there be? And so this is actually like, again, it's like, what's the number of routes that can attach? Like and so what are the number of routes that are configured to attach, not what are the number of routes that successfully have config running? That would be, ready routes or something like that, or programmed routes is the new name.
I think that's entirely fair. That is, I think, also one of the simplest possible ways to implement this. And it does feel pretty simple to explain when you're writing the spec too. So I like that interpretation.
I guess should ask the question, given that we've changed the names of all of these things, should we do a deprecation cycle on this, on attached routes as the name, and do the thing where we say, okay, the field attached routes is deprecated. We're going to add an accepted routes, which then matches up better with the condition name, and we do a and then we sort of say you need to populate both of these. We'll test the accepted routes, not the attached routes, but you should populate it for now, and then eventually we throw that, we drop that out of the API.
I think a field is really hard to drop at this level.
I know.
I feel like we're probably stuck with the field as it is.
I don't disagree. I wanted to have asked the question though.
Yeah. I don't know that it's that bad. Attached is not that far off from what we mean here. Ideally, yes, we do a rename or new field, or deprecation, whatever. But I think I'm okay with status quo, just a better spec.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm probably okay with it too, but I wanted to ask the question.
Okay, so we are running really close to out of time. We should probably make a decision on what kind of, if any, action item we want to take on this one, because there was kind of the question of what we were trying to do here. It sounds like number 2 is preferred. I think I can agree with that. So should we just document in here, Rob, or Rob, would you mind updating it that we talked about this and many of us agree on that? And if anybody doesn't agree on that, please, comment in here.
I'll put what I just said in the issue right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and that's our action item for that. We only have a couple minutes. I did want to actually go back real quick. We need to start putting priorities on these. We've just recently said that we're going to start doing that. Do we agree that this one is, wait, did I not put priorities in there? I did this recently. This one is important long-term, the race condition and route.
Yeah, I'd say that's true. Yeah.
I mean, we could potentially still do more than just documentation for it. And then this one we just talked about. This one is like probably important short-term, right?
Yeah, I think it's soon. Yeah.
Soon. That's what we called it. All right, cool. So just wanted to get that done. With 2 minutes left.
Can we actually skip to the very last thing on the agenda? Because I want to figure out if we're
Yeah, let's
actually
do that.
having a
We'll
meeting
come
next
back to
week.
TLS route conformance next time. Next week, I could be here. I probably won't. I have the day off, so.
It is not a public holiday for me, so I am happy to run a agenda light meeting again, if that's what people want to do. For people who are not in the US and thus are not celebrating the amazing legacy of MLK.
Sounds like it's on.
Yeah, I think we might as well leave it on the calendar. I know there's plenty of people that still end up working on that day, and our past agenda light meetings have been great. So thank you, Nick, for leading many of those. Yeah, I'm good to leave that, but I probably won't be there either.
Roger that. And with that, and 37 seconds left, I think we should call it a day. Thank you everyone for coming. We will be available next week, but it will be a, if you didn't catch what we were saying there, it's kind of like just, we're not writing down the agenda. We'll just come in and do kind of like just talking, like a forum kind of thing, where you can kind of just bring whatever comes to mind. Otherwise, we'll be back to normal the week after that.
Yeah, so next week, just bring anything you want to talk about, anything at all related to Gateway API. We'll talk about it.
Cheers, everyone.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye-bye.